Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second and final part of this short series. Today we are going to look at the years 1941 to 1945. If you haven't watched part 1 just yet, head on over to my YouTube channel and look at the previous upload, and to make it easier I will put a card on the top right to redirect you to that video. If you like this video, please leave a like and please sub if you haven't already, because 80% of the people who are watching this have not done it just yet. If you want to support this channel financially, you can become a member of this channel for €3 a month. This helps me tremendously and gives you advantages like a beautiful badge next to your name and early access to my videos. And now without further ado, let's get going. Operation Barbarossa. Only 2 months after the fall of both Greece and Yugoslavia, the largest invasion ever happened. This was codenamed Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union. The Germans did find some success with their blitzkrieg and encircling massive pockets of Soviet soldiers, but there were already signs that it would not be so easy as they first predicted. For example, the Soviets had better tanks than they had at the start of the war. The Soviet T-34 and the KV-1 were definitely superior to anything Germany fielded, with the only threat to them being the 88mm anti-tank cannon. And also the famous scorched earth technique, which was also used against Napoleon. This basically meant destruction of anything that might be useful to the enemy. In this case it was supplies. However, the Germans still gained territory fast, and in barely 2 months of fighting they already had reached Leningrad and Moscow. The siege of Moscow lasted 3 months and the Germans came within 10 to 12 miles of the city. And even though the Soviets had an estimated 4 times the casualties of the Germans, they were successful in defending their capital city. According to famous General Heinz Guderian, they underestimated the enemy's numbers because by this point they expected the entire Soviet army to have collapsed. They also underestimated the climate. The majority of the soldiers in the hospitals were there due to frostbite and not due to actual fighting. But for other cities it would not end as relatively quickly as the Moscow one. The siege in Leningrad would take 2 years and 4 months. Millions of people would die in the fighting and end up missing or dying or starve to death. Meanwhile, also in September 1941, the first British supply ships arrived to help out the Soviets. The Lend-Lease deal between the Soviet, British and also Americans provided to be critical for the Allied victory over the Germans. Boots, trucks, food, rifles, machine factory tools and more would all be supplied to the Soviets to keep them in the war. When you account for the inflation, the USA alone would have donated $180 billion to the Soviets over the course of the war. The Lend-Lease Act was so important that the USSR dictator Joseph Stalin admitted in 1943 that they would have lost the war if it wasn't for the Lend-Lease Act. And lastly, in 1941, on the 7th of December 1941, we saw the loss of 2,403 men in the attack of the Japanese on the Americans. The idea behind it was to cripple the United States Navy in one blow, force them into peace negotiations and have free reign over Southeast Asia. Considering one of the most important, biggest battleships was resting in Hawaii, this was Japan's main target. To prevent immediate retaliation, the Japanese first targeted the air bases on Pearl Harbor with the Aichi D-3A and the Mitsubishi A-6M0. After that, the first Nakajima B-5Ns arrived. These are the torpedo planes, which were highly effective against boats. Quite some boats sank and capsized in the first dive bomb run, but the second wave of bombers was far less effective. However, it still inflicted a lot of damage on the USS Pennsylvania and the USS Nevada. The US lost 6 warships and almost 200 planes, while having 13 more warships damaged. Even though in operational sense this was a success, they woke up the sleeping giant. And only 4 days later Germany decided to declare war on the USA. 1942 was a swing year. This was the year which determined everything, not only the future of Europe but the entire world. And the first major event was the Battle of Midway in the Pacific Theater. This was the last major offensive Japan was able to muster against the United States. They wanted to destroy the US Navy and force them to the peace negotiations table again. And even though they did do a lot of damage and eventually sunk one of their carriers, the USS Yorktown, and a destroyer, they lost 4 carriers and a heavy cruiser in the process. Another important battle during 1942 was the Battle of Stalingrad, and this is the battle which is generally considered to be the battle which turned the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. But this is one of the most desperate battles there was in the war. Some Soviet men did not see a single day of training and were sent to meet the Germans head on, and as you can expect, this caused extreme casualties. Equipment was rushed out as to produce as much as possible. Women and children were forced to help defend Stalingrad because the city had high importance for Soviet morale, because the city was named after their leader, Joseph Stalin. 11 days after the start of the Battle of Stalingrad, Joseph Stalin ordered Order 227, the order which meant no step back. If you were to break this order, you were sent to so-called penal battalion, rather than executed for so-called cowardice. These penal battalions saw extreme casualties. This is because they were sent to a point where the fighting was the fiercest. The first penal battalion which was used during the Battle of Stalingrad, and only after 3 days was almost absolutely annihilated. The number of people who were convicted ranged between the 400,000 and 500,000 men. Very few of these men are known to have survived the war. The Battle of Stalingrad saw a lot of house-to-house fighting, and this gives the defenders generally a massive advantage if they can secure the rear for supplies and have a decent force. Eventually the Germans lost this battle, and this defeat was major. They lost a lot of their forces in Stalingrad, and it was calculated that the Axis lost over 1 million troops in Stalingrad. And even though the Soviets lost as many troops if not more, they could be replaced a lot easier than the Germans could replace their veteran German troops. The defeat in Stalingrad also led Germany to retreat from the Caucasus entirely because Operation Little Saturn threatened them to cut them off. And lastly in 1942 the Second Battle of El Alamein. But first a small rewind. Early in 1942, the Battle of Gazala, the British and the Commonwealth forces had a painful loss and they were in a full retreat to Egypt. In Egypt a new defensive line was set up 500 kilometers to the right, near El Alamein. The idea was to utilize the surroundings and use that to your advantage. El Alamein was surrounded by a salt marsh area and this would prevent the passage of heavy armored vehicles. And to the other side is the sea, so this would be the perfect position to build a new defensive line against the highly motorized Afrika Korps. Thanks to the well selected defensive position, they were able to stop the German advance to the Suez Canal. One thing that was definitely in the Allies' favor was that the Germans were very difficult to supply. Because first they had to pass through the contested waters of the Mediterranean Sea and then the extreme distance over land. This for everything: fuel tanks, cars, food and water. All the while the British and the Allies, for example the Indians, Australians and South Africans, French and more, were preparing for a counterattack. And while the strength of the Commonwealth forces was growing, the Axis dug in, also using their terrain to the advantage. Rommel built the Devil's Garden. This was triggered with anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, anti-tank guns, trenches and barbed wire. He also kept their armor in the rear, to be deployed at will to prevent a breakthrough, but once deployed it could not be redeployed due to a lack of fuel. Montgomery wanted to use a feint attack in the south and wanted to really attack him in the north. To deceive the Axis they built up fake tanks in the south to make it seem like the main attack would happen in the south. All the while the tanks in the north were made to look like trucks. The battle started with a massive barrage and then the engineers were to clear the mines. After a couple of days battling, Rommel decided to draw all of his men to the north after the attack in the south of the Allies had failed. This is when Montgomery started Plan Supercharge. This was slow fighting, but in the end numerical superiority meant that they were able to break through. A massive tank battle also began after the mines were cleared. The Axis put up a good defense, but seeing that the situation was dire, Rommel retreated. They sent in the Italians to stop the British to cover the German escape, but they were getting absolutely annihilated. This victory was massive for Britain, being the beginning of the end of the Axis in Africa, which ended on the 13th of May 1943, when they were at last kicked out of Tunisia after a fierce battle. Returning to the Eastern Front, the Axis attempted to take the city of Kursk in the hope that they would be able to encircle a large army, cut them off from supplies and exploit the gap. This saw brutal fighting across the front and was credited to be the largest tank battle ever in history. This also saw the introduction of the Panzer V tank, Nashorn Ferdinand tank destroyers and the Sturmpanzer IV and more. This battle saw close to 10,000 tanks participate in this battle. The fighting raged on for 12 days, but in the end the Soviets were able to repel the German advances and in turn were able to send the Germans running. After, it was easy to see why some people consider the operation foolish, and it's because of the fact that the Soviets had about 3 times the manpower of the Germans, 2 times their tanks and 2.5 times the artillery. However, like most of these battles, the Germans did have an advantage in casualties. But it took the Germans way longer to lick their wounds, taking them over 1 year to fully replace their losses, while the Soviets with far higher casualties did this within 2 months. The Soviets were never really close to losing this battle because the Germans never really made enough headway to pose a significant threat to the Soviets. In July 1943, the beginning of the end had started for Italy. And as a result, Mussolini's regime came to an end and he was ended on the 28th of April 1945. The fall of Italy started back in July 1943 when the Allied forces invaded Sicily. Sicily was extremely important because Sicily allowed the Allies to have more security during shipping, and it would also prove to be a good base for further conquests of the mainland. Not long after Mussolini was overthrown from power, Italy declared war on its former ally, Germany. Further invasions would happen to try to liberate Italy, like the invasion of Anzio for example, which was a success but saw a lot of casualties. Operation Overlord is one of the most well-known operations of World War II, the storming of the 5 beaches by mainly 3 different allied nations. And of course these nations are Canada, the United Kingdom and the United States of America. And the name of the beaches were Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha and Utah. It saw hundreds of thousands of young men liberate France from the clutches of Germany, and casualty reports may vary a lot on the subject, but in general it's very much accepted that Omaha was the best defended beach. Having more casualties than Sword, Juno and Utah combined, and having in percentages about the same casualties as paratroopers. The first point to be liberated on continental France was Pegasus Bridge, which was taken in about 10 minutes. The fighting was fierce and there was a lot of pressure to take cities like Cherbourg for supplies, and eventually the US 79th Infantry Division liberated Cherbourg. Also, the fighting for cities like Caen took longer than expected. The British and Allies wanted to take the city in 1 day, but it was prevented by 2 panzer divisions. Interestingly enough, the British actually fought 70% of the tanks in Normandy, which for me was quite unexpected. The fighting for Caen went on for 6 entire weeks before finally being liberated, but that brought a massive toll with it. 30,000 Anglo-Canadian soldiers lost their lives and 80% of the city was completely destroyed, and more than 3,000 civilians died during the fighting, including 300 civilians due to Allied bombing. Germany by this time was already very much overstretched, having a front in the Soviet Union, Italy and now also in France. So as you can imagine, supplying the units was getting more difficult. According to one of my sources, Germany was only able to replace 6% of its soldiers which were out of combat. Another issue was that they were very much undersupplied, only getting about 32% of the supplies they actually needed, and everything was about to get worse because Romania decided to do a coup. The Allies tried to do another massive offensive, but this time in the Netherlands, codenamed Operation Market Garden. This was the largest airborne attack to date, and the aim was to secure 3 different bridges: the Maas River, the Rhine and the Waal bridges, until the ground forces could reinforce them. The German resistance around Arnhem, however, was bigger than expected. According to some of my sources, the Dutch resistance tried to warn the Allies forces about the 2 SS tank divisions, but this was promptly ignored. Thinking that the Germans could not be strong anymore, this operation eventually turned into a costly failure, as 11,000 died and about 6,000 men were taken prisoner. A lot of historians speculate that if this operation would have been a success, that the USA and the Allies would be the first to have reached Berlin. The last German offensive was the Ardennes offensive. This was also Hitler's last hope of winning the war, even though this hope was very much misplaced. The idea was to punch through the Ardennes force with everything they had and force the Allies back in the sea. The offensive started with around 400,000 infantrymen and 1,500 tanks. Even though the Germans had numerical superiority in the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge and early success, the USA was quick to reinforce their lines, and even though the Germans did make quite some progress, heroic defense of vital roads and the improvement in weather allowed the Allies to do more air raids on German supplies, which already were quite bad. The weather also amplified the shortages in fuel. Because of all of this, the German advance near the end of December came to a stop. In early January the Allies went on the offensive, and near the end of the month the Allies had regained all their lost territory. And from that point onwards it was just a countdown until the full collapse of the Third Reich. On the 16th of April 1945 the Battle of Berlin started, and only 14 days later the then leader of the Third Reich committed death. Germany fought on for 7 more days until eventually surrendering, however Japan was still fighting. The USA had a choice: either lose hundreds of thousands of lives trying an invasion of the home island of Japan, or trying to bomb their cities with a new weapon called the atomic bomb and try to force them in peace negotiations. And so it was. The United States dropped their first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August and on the 9th of August on Nagasaki. Also on the 9th of August, the Soviet Union launched their invasion of Japanese Manchuria. Japan, seeing that the situation completely was turned against them, they decided to surrender on the 2nd of September 1945, signaling the end of World War II. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito remained in power to ensure the stability of the nation and to secure the compliance of the Japanese armed forces. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that was it for today's video. It took me a long while to create it, so I definitely hope you enjoyed it. A massive shout out to VW German, Luker Beetle and Sander for being members of my channel. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by becoming a member of my channel. That is €3 a month, which gets you amazing perks like early access to videos like this. Other than that, like and subscribe to my channel, share it with friends and family. I got a video on the left, a playlist on the right if you're interested in that, and other than that, have a very good day.